First of all, I just wanted to acknowledge the role of carers, loved ones really, members of families, just making sure that someone in their midst is okay and supporting them through often very difficult times. We have ourselves in my family experienced mental ill health. Our oldest son, was diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder at the age of 16. And there have been times over the last 11 years when we've gone through real sort of emotional turmoil. It's been at times incredibly difficult. And so our family experience has given me some insight into what other people go through. And the brutal truth is that there have been times, if we're honest, where we have just felt that the NHS hasn't been there for us, and we've sought help elsewhere for our son. Because ultimately you do what you can for a loved one. But it's always left me feeling, it's okay if you have money. What about all those people who don't have the money to do it? And I find that completely intolerable. And in a way, that's what puts me on a complete mission to fight for what I just call equality for people who suffer from mental ill health, and indeed their families. And if I just wanted to identify some of the ways in which people suffering mental ill health are disadvantaged. So, for example, there was a story recently, this week, in fact, in the Eastern Daily Press about someone, actually a constituent of mine, who, after making an attempt on his own life, was transferred in a very basic van-like vehicle, very late at night, from the Norfolk and Norwich Hospital to the Priory in South London. The journey itself, in my view, was an outrage. He talked to me about how, over the entire journey, the man sitting next to him spoke to him once, between Norfolk and South London, late at night. A totally alien environment. He was then left there for 10 nights, incidentally at enormous cost to the system, with no therapeutic input at all, and then returned to Norfolk. Another man on the same ward in the Priory, also from Norfolk, was told at 1 a.m. that in an hour's time he would be taken back to Norfolk because a bed had become available. We don't do this to people who have a physical health problem. Just imagine the outcry that there would be if someone with a stroke or a heart condition got picked up in an ambulance in Norfolk and was told, we're going to take you 200 miles away, or we're going to take you to Lancashire or Northumberland or wherever it might be. But this happens week in, week out for people suffering from mental ill health. And you know what? When I was faced as the minister with freedom of information surveys done by campaign groups demonstrating what was happening, and I asked officials for the data that we had on the practice around the country, and I was told we have no data. We don't collect it nationally on out-of-area placements, as they're called. So I insisted that we must collect the data, we must monitor what's happening across the country, area by area, so that we can then start to hold people to account. It's a very varied practice across the country. There are some areas where there are no out-of-area placements at all, other areas where it's frankly outrageous. So that's one area. Still in this society, a society that we call civilized, we still have about 3,500 people a year who end up in a police cell as a result of a mental health crisis. It's defined in the legislation as a place of safety, that's what it's called. I don't regard that as a place of safety for someone who's perhaps acutely anxious, who may be paranoid, who may be going through an incredibly difficult period, to be locked up behind bars in a police station is not acceptable in a civilized society. There are still, I think it's about 150 young people under the age of 18 who ended up last year in a police cell. We managed in the last 2 years to halve the numbers who go into police cells as a result of something which we called the Crisis Care Concordat, which for the first time set standards about what should happen in crisis care. But we now need to go further than that, ban it completely for under 18s. I remember being on 5 Live just after a girl who was in her teens who spoke about how she felt completely ashamed. She was the first member of her family ever to be found in a police cell. She'd committed no crime. She was just ill, acutely ill, and she was put in a police cell. This has to end. It has to be banned in law, and it has to be made the absolute total exception for adults. It could only be justified if it's the only place that could properly provide for someone who may be a risk to themselves, an immediate risk to themselves or to someone else. But for the vast majority of cases, it should simply end. There are still in our society far too many people who end up in prison as a result of being mentally ill. This is a scandal of our time, and we have to end this practice. We've started the rollout, it's now in Norfolk, the national model, of something called liaison and diversion. There have been different models around the country, but it's been very haphazard. Now there is a national model to ensure that when someone ends up in a police station or a court for the first time and they have a diagnosable mental health condition, that they are referred for diagnosis and treatment. And the objective of this is to divert people away from the criminal justice system to give them the chance of a better life. And then finally, just another example of, well, 2 examples. It's so important that we understand medical conditions better. And so there is a vast amount of money spent, rightly so, on understanding cancer better and finding cures for cancer. And we've made dramatic advances over the last few years in the ability to cure cancer and for people to survive cancer. And the numbers of people who survive cancer are dramatically increasing. And then you look at mental health, and the prevalence of mental health in terms of impact on well-being is very significant in our society, and yet the amount of money spent on mental health research is tiny compared to the amount of money spent on cancer research. Why? What justification is there? And in part it's because of the stigma of mental health. People have traditionally felt unable to go out and talk about it. They've felt unable to go out and campaign on it, and that has to change. We have to have parity, equality on access to research funding as well as on access to treatment. And the final area that I just wanted to describe, if you have suspected cancer and you turn up at your GP, you have a right to see a specialist within 2 weeks of that referral by your GP. If you turn up in A&E, the standard is that you get treated and seen, dealt with within 4 hours. The system is under massive pressure, but there is a standard there. If you need a hip joint replacement or any other operation for a physical condition, you must have your operation within 18 weeks of referral by your GP. And then you go across to mental health. And until April this year, there was no access standards, no rights of access at all in mental health. How can you possibly justify that? So what we're talking about here is, in effect, discrimination at the heart of the publicly funded NHS. This is the NHS that we all love and that we are all committed to. And yet, the brutal truth is that it discriminates against people who suffer from mental ill health. And so I was determined to start the process of introducing maximum waiting times in mental health. So to give you an example, a teenager who suffers a first episode of psychosis, we know there's a load of evidence that if you intervene quickly with that teenager, if you get them access to treatment straight away, you give that person the chance of a good life. You can often stop that condition in its tracks. You can stop further episodes, psychotic episodes. If you do nothing, if you neglect it, or if you delay treatment, then the chance is that it becomes entrenched and that that individual runs the risk of a pretty miserable life, a life on benefits, a life with difficult personal relationships. So why on earth not ensure that those individuals get the chance of treatment straight away? So from April this year, we introduced the first ever maximum waiting time standard in mental health for early intervention in psychosis, a 2-week standard that starts treatment within 2 weeks. It starts with 50% of people getting their treatment started within 2 weeks, and the objective is that you build up capacity within the system, then you increase the percentage of people who start their treatment within 2 weeks. And the result of that is that there is investment across the system in introducing that standard. And it's not just access to any old treatment, it's access to evidence-based treatment so that you get the best possible care in order to enable you to recover. So for me, to achieve equality, we have to ensure that every person who suffers from mental ill health has the right to access treatment on a timely basis, based on clinical judgment, and accessing treatment that is evidence-based. And we know from the evidence that is there that if we do this, you achieve a saving further down the track. You stop the condition from developing, from becoming more entrenched. You stop that individual deteriorating in their health. So it is both morally right that people have the same right to treatment as anyone else, but it is also economically stupid to neglect this. So my demand is that we continue the fight for equality for those who suffer from mental ill health. Next week, I've led an initiative on a cross-party basis, actually. I'm hoping that it will be launched on Monday, so watch out for it. But it will be about the demand for equality. We've got the government spending review coming up on the 25th of November. And many people don't realise the importance of a spending review, but this sets spending on public services for the whole of this Parliament. So it is critically important. And we need to make the case to the government, and it's in their interest, it's in their economic interest. They will achieve savings further down the track if they do this, but they must inject extra investment into mental health to achieve equality, because the current situation, that discrimination, that historic injustice against people who suffer from mental ill health has to end. Thank you very much.